Things that burn. Leaves. The Navarre were ready for the coming of Cold Sun. Among the first targets of the Scions was the pool of silver clouds, and following that attack, the vigilance of the nation saw them and their allies among the great forest orcs not only drive off an attack on Therenin, but offer aid to beleaguered settlements across the Empire. Then the armies appeared. In Hercynia and Mearan, two forces bent on destruction. The trods of Hercynia were torn asunder, a prelude of what was to come. Now the still walkers and the empty hands seek to visit further ruin on the mountains and the forests and the gentle plains. The still walkers. In a quiet cavern, reached only by a desperate scramble up a barely scalable cliff in North Pines, burns an eternal flame. It has been there since Hercynia was Hacinian, enduring the reign of Turuniel and the ravages of the Valorn. It's almost a secret, its presence of interest only to a small handful of Vates, with an interest in using day magic to purify venom. In happier times, one of the Vates might clamber up here to commune with the Flame Warden, a herald of Zehu was Elenrith, and perhaps gain some of the flame-purified water that would aid them in their healing magic. The Flame Warden is gone now, having disappeared when the Imperial Conclave declared Zehu was Elenrith to be a threat to the Empire. They have not been seen since. At some point shortly before the autumn equinox, the hills near the quiet cavern are rocked with a thunderous detonation. Curious Navarre scouts who came to investigate discovered a perfectly circular hole burned into, or more properly out of, the cliffside where the cave of the eternal flame once was. They also found several thousand scions of Cold Sun just beginning to fan out through the mountains. Only one of those curious scouts made it to the nearest steading, to bring a terrible warning of what was coming. The still walkers had arrived in Hercynia. It was distressingly easy to track the progress of these scions as they began to spread out. The mountains of northern Hercynia are covered in a thick blanket of pines and firs, and where the heralds went, the trees began to burn. A pall of smoke rose over the North Pines. In those first few days, the news leapt from one end of Hercynia to the other on the swift feet of messengers and stridings. The steadings looked to their defences, but those that could spare the thorns sent them north to aid their cousins in the peaks to contain the threat. The first skirmishes with the still walkers resulted in painful losses to the North Pines Navarre. The situation looked grim. Grimmer still when a wave of magical energy ripped through the territory, shattering the trods. Normally it would be a simple matter to replace them, but the horror that holds Deer's Folly means the ritual can only be performed from a Regio there, a serious undertaking. Then, just after the autumn equinox, accompanied by the first flurries of snow, a potent ward of spring magic settled over the mountains. That blanket of trees that the scions saw only as kindling began to grow and weave together, fires extinguishing as dark bark took on the strength of the peaks themselves. The bears and wolves turned savagely against the unnatural invaders, in some cases actually fighting alongside the Navarre defenders. A handful of heralds, youths in simple garb but possessed with wisdom beyond their apparent years, began to appear among the trees, helping those trapped by fire or scion to get to safety, and where they could not flee, fighting as savagely as any beast of the deep woods alongside the Navarre. Imperial magicians had forged the wooden fastness over North Pines, calling the power of Irahara to directly oppose Cold Sun. The various bands of still walkers immediately ceased their attacks and withdrew back toward that cliffside from which they had first emerged. Taking advantage of the protection of the living forest, the Navarre defenders cautiously closed in. At sunrise, 3 days after the magic settled over North Pines, the entire army of the still walkers vanished. Those keen-eyed, stealthy Navarre in a position to observe quickly spread word of what happened. In the early dawn, the scions gathered into groups around their archons, who in turn surrounded the Grand Archon. There was a clear design, a geometric arrangement of 3,000 heralds filling the valley below the blasted cliff. The Grand Archon began to glow, then the other Archons followed suit. Then every one of the thousands of scions present burned with an aura of steady blue light that became brighter and brighter as the sun began to rise. With a catastrophic crack and a sudden inrushing of wind that swept some of the scouts off their feet, the Still Walkers were gone, as was a significant portion of the now collapsing cliffside. A few keen-eyed Navarre swore that something very like a colossal bolt of lightning leapt up from the Grand Archon the moment before the heralds vanished. They did not stay vanished for long. Before the sun had set, the news broke that the Still Walkers were now in Summer's End, not far from the heartwood of the Great Vale. Somehow, the Still Walkers were able to replicate the power of the Sentinel Gate, at least on a small scale, travelling from one place to another as a bolt of force. Fortunately, the vigilant Navarre steadings of the south were ready to defend themselves. Several settlements in Summer's End are built on a foundation of old Terunial structures. Their eyes are turned toward the Valorn of Deer's Folly, but their defences are just as efficacious against the Scions. The Thorns gather at the newly established Great Forest Orcs steading of High Pines, and at Morning Hollow to protect the Great Library of Hakinian. It takes more than one clever trick to frighten the Navarre. Courage is not enough, however. The Scions of Cold Sun begin once again to spread out, firing the trees, readying to crush any steading in their path, threatening both the Weirwood Grove and the Centre of Learning at Morning Hollow. Then, thankfully, the Black Thorns arrive. They have marched all the way from Madruga in the south, and along the way they have gathered more than 30 Navarre captains and their warbands from across the Empire. Messengers have already warned the army that the Scions have moved, and there is no pause. They smash straight into the Still Walkers from the south, drawing the other defenders together under their banner. Savage battle is joined. For all their courage, the Black Thorns are tired from the long journey, from the entire breadth of the Empire. Yet they are no more minded to give ground than the Scions are, especially when the heralds threaten the library where the brightest minds in the Empire are gathered to find a solution to the great mistake. The tide turns almost immediately. The Still Walkers have gone from facing desperate resistance to being outnumbered 3-1. The Blackthorns do not have everything their own way. The Scions still demonstrate a supernatural clarity and are able to coordinate their forces over great distances more effectively than the Navarre are. Yet at the end of the day, for all the boons of their terrible patron, they can still be slain. Their lines can still be broken, they still fall before a perfectly placed arrow, still stumble when the legacy of thorns pierces their skin, still fall before spear, axe, or sword. The Black Thorns have no shortage of these things. They are forced to give ground, pushed back not only from the Great Library, but away from the heartwood of the Great Vale. They retreat west toward Old Ranging, but it becomes clear that while they may be able to travel great distances when the conditions are right, they are no match for the manoeuvrability of the Black Thorns. 2 weeks before the winter solstice, caught in a rapidly closing trap, the Still Walkers again pulls its forces together in one place. Smoke hangs in a black thundercloud over Summer's End as the Scions clear a great circle of trees with their terrible blue light. As night falls, it becomes clear that the surviving Scions intend to try and escape the noose. This time, though, the Navarre know what is happening. The Blackthorns do not wait for the morning, but take advantage of the light provided by the burning trees and the bright moon. They launch a night assault against the Still Walkers, seeking to defeat them before they can make good their escape. The Scions fight like cornered rats, or rather, the Scions around the perimeter fight with desperate zeal, and when one falls, another steps into the gap immediately. Hundreds of Still Walkers fall to the Navarre, nearly a third of their number, but then, as night begins to turn to day, crack. Gone. Fled, leaving behind a shallow crater of bare earth among the burning trees and the clouds of ash that are all that remains of the fallen heralds. This time, there's no indication where they have fled. The more optimistic among the Navarre celebrate, believing they have been driven back to the endless ocean of the Day Realm. Wiser heads are not so sure. The Still Walkers may have been outmatched, may have lost nearly 1,000 scions, but even a reduced force could still inflict unsustainable damage on the Empire, depending on where they had travelled to. How far can they travel? The Navarre have been fortunate. Between the wooden fastness in North Pines and the Black Thorns, the Still Walkers were kept constantly on the back foot. Forced to focus their attention on the defenders, they had little opportunity to slaughter. They have still scarred the land. Trees that had stood for 2 centuries or more burned to ashes. Steadings built hundreds of years before the Empire was even a dream turned to ash. Yet the people, for the most part, have survived. The death toll is in the tens of human and orc souls, rather than the hundreds of thousands who might have fallen. The Black Thorns have sacrificed to protect their people. Nearly 300 thorns fell to the scions. The greatest sorrow is that for many of them there will be no funeral, and no chance to rest in the glades beneath the shadows of the trees. The spite of Cold Sun has robbed them of that final honour. Game information: Hercynia. The defenders of Hercynia have been bloodied, but the Still Walkers were roundly beaten. They have, however, escaped the territory. They may have returned to the realms, or they may have arrived somewhere else in the Empire. Only time will tell. The Trods in Hercynia remain severed, as does the Valorn of Deer's Folly. They cannot be replaced from Anvil due to the limitations of the Dance of Navarre and Thorn. Rather, a quest through the Sentinel Gate is likely to be required to reach one of the Spring Regio within the Valorn itself. No such conjunction of the gate has been noted as yet. The Empty Hands. The steadings of gentle oakways are nestled among farms and pastureland, and scattered stands of the old oak trees that give the region its name. There is a quietness here that is rare in the Navarre territories. Or rather, there was, until ruin came to Thoma's Well. A gentle spring of cool, sweet water, the well was a minor regio tied to the day realm. Shepherds would gather there to share songs and stories, and to sleep beneath the stars. Now all that remains is a patched bowl of cracked clay. As the regio waxed under the power of the recent imperial enchantment, it became a portal for the Empty Hands, who rose from the depths in the last weeks before the autumn equinox. The steadings are barely prepared to face the threat of Cold Sun. While Miaran is one of the safest places in the Empire, there are warriors here, of course, Thorns and Brands who have fought Valorn and Barbarian alike in their time. Many of them, though, have not seen battle for years and are ill-prepared. They are little match for the army arrayed against them, and the first steadings in Oakways fall to the scions within days of the equinox. Imperial magicians have done what they can to protect Miaran. A ward of spring magic has been forged over the gold glades. When the scions came to Miaran during the summer, they were focused on the destruction of the pool of silver stars, and perhaps there was an assumption this would be their aim again. This time, their attacks seem indiscriminate. The presence of the ward helps a little, freeing the steadings there to send their warriors to help the rest of the territory. It slows the scions' attacks, but in the end it cannot prevent widespread destruction across the heartland of the Navarre nation. Like the other armies assailing the Empire, the Empty Hands demonstrate supernatural coordination and a terrible insight into the exploitable weaknesses of their opponents. Yet this is not the most grievous thing about these scions. Their channelers and archons are able to evoke a dreadful blue-green radiance that, in stark contrast to the natural light of the sun, has a terrible effect on living plants. Where the light touches, trees and plants begin to calcify. They become hard and grey, each branch, root, leaf and stem rendered into a substance partway between bone and soft stone. The soil around the dying plant is poisoned, becoming chalk-like sand that will not sustain wholesome life. This mark of Cold Sun's malign presence is most concentrated in Oakways, whole swathes of woodland killed and remade. The longer the scions spend in a place, the more complete the transformation. A further indignity. As the winter solstice draws closer, the empty hands regroup to consolidate their control of Oakways. Shortly before the solstice, a sudden pulse of magic rips across the entire territory. As in Varushka, the trods in Miaran are rent asunder over the course of a dozen heartbeats. Magical paths that have resisted the passage of centuries, unmade in a moment. The energy goes further than in the north, perhaps because the trods are that much older and that much more stable. It grounds itself through a number of spring regio. Only the weakest are destroyed, but all touched by the cold fire are damaged. Even Gold Glades is not spared, and as in Volodmarts and Karov, several Vates are badly burned as the energy surges along the trods. While the core of the invading army remains in Oakways, they launch assaults into Holtford, Greenfalls, and even Serenael. The scions do not attack Seren itself, but all across Miaran steadings are assailed, stridings intercepted, wayhouses burned. Those who cannot fight seek sanctuary in Gold Glades and behind the walls of Seren. Most manage to find a measure of safety, but some are less fortunate, intercepted by the empty hand and slain without mercy. Hundreds of humans and orcs are slain, their bodies seared to ashes. There will be no rest in the funeral glades for the victims of Cold Sun. As well as the cost in lives, there is a more symbolic loss in Miaran. The empty hands, like all the armies of Cold Sun, are drawn to places of beauty, art, and culture. Peaceful monuments, colleges, and places of natural beauty across the territory are targeted for destruction. Perhaps the most cruel loss is the destruction of First Voice Glade, raised in memory of Geracht Brackensong. The Grand Archon of the Empty Hand itself leads the force that burns the school there. Most of the staff and students make it to safety, but the structure itself is torn apart and the beautiful trees transformed into cursed stone effigies. A painful symbol of the damage being done to the heart of the Navarre nation. Game information, Miaran. The Empty Hands are almost a third of the way towards conquering Oakways. The region has gained the petrified quality, representing the damage done to the settlements and the land itself. It may be possible to reverse the destruction if the Empty Hands are driven out of the territory, but the more of the region they conquer, the harder it will be. Should they conquer the entire region, the transformation will be permanent. The trods of Miaran have been destroyed, just as those in Hakinia and Varushka have been. While the Dance of Navarre and Thorn could replace them, the outcome is likely to be the same as in the north. Cold Sun's scions will simply rip them apart again as soon as they begin to form, and may gain further insight into their operation in the process. The scions have destroyed First Voice Glade. The title of the Dean of the First Voice Glade still exists, but with the loss of the sinecure, they no longer receive their bounty of herbs. Participation, Miaran. As with Karov and Volodmarts, if your character is a magician with at least one rank of spring lore, you may choose to have been burned by the energy that destroyed the trods.